right. Um, Michel Foucault, French philosopher, um, postmodern philosopher. And what kind of postmodern philosopher? Because there are many types. Yeah, I guess he starts off as a structuralist, which means he tries to kind of examine structures within society in order to strip away their layers until he finds, you know, the original historical point of origin for such structures. Uh, and then in later in his career, he becomes a post-structuralist, which means he still does the same thing, but with the recognition that there's no point of origin at the beginning, right? There's no like original structure underneath it all, right? These structures are kind of built on nothingness because they are social structures. And what that means is it'll become a little bit more clear as the lecture progresses. A little bit of a biographical background. He's basically a historian of ideas and a historian of, as I mentioned, various structures within society. These can be ideological structures, but they can also be, um, you know, disciplinary structures, legal structures, political structures, economic structures, various kinds. He was mostly writing in the 1960s up until the early 80s. He was definitely influenced by Karl Marx, Friedrich Nietzsche, and Sigmund Freud. Two out of those three, which we've covered in this class, and you'll see some of those ideas in there. He was one of the first world famous intellectuals to be openly gay. And he ends up being a casualty of HIV and AIDS in 1984 when he passes away. And it was a devastating loss for the intellectual community as well as for the LGBTQ community. Um, and so, you know, Michel Foucault definitely lived his ideas and his thoughts. He was not afraid to expose who he truly was, um, you know, as a way of kind of speaking truth to power, like a lot of the thinkers we've been covering throughout the semester. Um, so today, our first lecture is going to come from two books, two collections of essays that he came up with. The first one of them is called Power Knowledge, and then the other one is called Discipline and Punish. And if you see a kind of um, theme going on there, then you've got a good eye. But Foucault doesn't leave much for the imagination with those titles, obviously. So, the first idea that Foucault kind of tries to get us to understand is that power is much more diversified than what we normally think of when we think of power. For the most part, when we think of power, we think of like the government, and it makes laws and it punishes you if you don't follow those laws, right? Kind of like what Hobbes was talking about a few lectures back. Foucault tells us that actually uh, power exists in relations that circulate kind of like a dynamic of power throughout society on every level in terms of every relationship that creates society in the first place, right? So Foucault recognizes that society is created by relationships, right? The relationships of the business owner and the workers, the relationship of the bank and its customers, the relationship of parents to children, the relationship of spouses to each other and partners, the relationship of people in cars next to each other on the highway going 75 miles an hour, right? Like, there are relationships between anybody and everybody. And that's exactly what society is. It's these relationships existing, and power circulates through all of them, kind of like the blood through the veins and the arteries and capillaries. And so he says that power relations, right, are an economy of power that circulates through society on every level, amid every relationship possible between the people within that society in a variety of forms, right? So even between the people right? Like between partners, for example, or lovers. There's not just one way that they relate that has to do with power, right? There are many different ways that they relate to each other, and the power circulates between them in different ways through each of those. For example, you and your lover, you may be the one that calls the shots when it comes to where you eat, but they might be the one that calls the shots on how you spend the money, right? Or they might be the ones that call the shot when it comes to raising the kids, but you may be the one that calls the shot in terms of what happens in the bedroom. I don't know. These are just kind of random examples. But the point is, like, even in one relationship between two individuals, there are a multiplicity of ways in which they relate to each other, and there's a different power dynamic in each of them. So now multiply that by all the other people in your life, all the people in your neighborhood, all the people you work with, all the people in the city, right? So power is not just law and punishment. It's not just negative, right? Here, negative means as in like no, or you cannot do this, or else you will lose that, right? It's not just removing rights or actions or abilities or removing property or removing your health or your life, right? Like that's Hobbes's idea of power. Now, for Foucault, that is still power, but that's just the negative form of power. There's also an affirming form of power, right? You can do this. You will gain that. And then there's also creative power. This is the way we shall see the world. This is how we shall see explain how the world works, right? So notice that power is not just like a taking away by a saying a no. It's also a giving by saying yes, and it's also a constructing, right, by saying what if. All of these are different aspects of power. So examples, right, of what it means. Well, law, right, law enforcement, morality, ideology and worldview. This is where you see the Nietzsche and the Marx in him, right? He's pointing out that ideology, philosophy, right, being a Democrat, being a Republican, being a white supremacist, being a Black Lives Matter, being a Blue Lives Matter, being LGBTQ, being a feminist, being misogynist, being, Christian, being Jewish, being Muslim, being an anarchist, being a Marxist, being a capitalist, whatever, right? These different isms, ideologies, and worldviews are forms of power. They're forms of power by the people who rule those ideologies. They gain power from you when you become a follower. But you also gain power by becoming a follower because you become one of a larger mass that you depend on in opposition and conflict against other masses and groups, right? So there's this idea of safety in numbers or empowerment in numbers. And so there's power in these ideologies that's circulating, right? Social convention, right? Manners, right? Expectations of people. These are forms of power as well. Surveillance is a form of power. Internalization is a form of power. We'll talk about that in a few minutes. Education is a form of power, right? Think of Pink Floyd, those of you that like rock and roll. Pink Floyd, The Wall, right? He says, hey, teacher, leave those kids alone. All in all, you're just another brick in the wall, right? The idea that education is a form of planting seeds in young minds in order to get them to think a certain way, right? Right? There's a reason why some of us go into education. There's a reason why, for example, Republicans want to look carefully at what educators teach because there's a power in that. Now, there's a power in what the Republicans are doing as well, not only politically, but also through their preachers and their ministers and their political action committees, and same thing with the Democrats through their books and the groups that they associate with. There's power in all of this, right? Expertise is a form of power. When you become an expert, you place your authority as a form of power over others. It's expected that they should listen and obey you because of your expertise, right? Propaganda, which we talked about with Arendt, right? Narratives are a form of power, and so Notice power is much more complicated than just creating laws and putting them in jail, right? And so when we come to surveillance, right? Let's take a look at surveillance to see how power works, right? Foucault creates this. Well, he didn't create it actually, but he kind of uses it in a new way. Um, he uses this concept of the panopticon, right? The panopticon literally means the all-seeing eye. And Foucault argues that in modern society, there is a panopticon of surveillance, right? An all-seeing eye. Those of you that are fantasy fans, think of like Lord of the Rings, right? Deep in Mordor, right? The there's the dark tower with Sauron's eye that flashes like this kind of like light that helps him see what's happening in his country, right? That's the panopticon, the all-seeing eye of surveillance. Um, and so one of the things that Foucault points out is, right, that the way that surveillance really works is if we know that there's an all-seeing eye out there, right, we know it's there, but we don't always know if it's being used. Like we always know it's there for people to be watching, but are we the ones being watched right now? And so we never are sure if we're being watched at any given moment. This forces us to expect to be watched all the time. And so since we expect to be watched all the time, whether we're being watched or not, we begin to watch ourselves. And so we internalize the surveillance, right? We become a tool of surveillance by keeping surveillance on ourselves, by assuming that we're always being watched. And this way, we end up enforcing on ourselves the behavior that's expected by the people that are normally watching us through surveillance, right? How does this happen? Where does this happen, right? The examples that Foucault gives us are prisons, right? You see that first picture there on the left, right? In the prison, notice you have the guard tower in the middle, and then you have all the actual prison cells all around it in a circle. And so the prisoners are never sure at any given moment are they being watched and what they're doing being recorded, right? And so this whole process he describes occurs. Notice the next one is hospital, right? Intensive care units. The nursing station is in the middle, and they have all these devices keeping surveillance. Now here, it's not about interiorization of like behavior. It's about monitoring and surveillance on the body. Like, is the body behaving the way it's supposed to, or is it misbehaving, right? Which causes them to come in to give you medicine or do like more tests or whatever the case may be, right? Notice the next one after that is schools, right? Like schools are increasingly becoming more panoptic, right? With more and more surveillance. They already definitely have surveillance in the cafeteria, in the hallways, and in the gyms, right? But now people, organizations like TEA and other organizations want to put surveillance inside the classrooms themselves, right? And they already have surveillance through the computers that the students use, right? Through the Wi-Fi. Think of all the warnings you always get at HCC, for example, or wherever you go to school, right? And so there's already kind of like this surveillance that's taking place within the school. And then let's not forget the teacher, right? The teacher walks around, checking to see that you're doing your work, making sure you're not cheating on the test, etc. So there's another one. Now, stores, that's a given one, right down in the middle at the bottom, right? You've got those little, seeing eyeballs up at the ceiling, watching to make sure you're not shoplifting. But the two that people don't think about much, the one on the left at the bottom is the house, right? The house has a panopticon as well. Notice that in the schematic, to get to the garage where the cars, right, or to get to the front door to get out of the house, you have to go through the living areas, right? So you have to be seen by the family as you walk in and out, right? It's a way of kind of monitoring the kids, monitoring for strangers or intruders or whatever, right? So even the house has a form of surveillance as well. The one on the far right in the bottom side as well, that one's a church. right? It doesn't matter if you go to a synagogue, a temple, a church, whatever you want to call it, for whatever religion you follow. The idea has historically been that everybody can see everybody else, and the preacher or the priest or the minister or whatever can see everybody as well, and they can see him or her as well, and then presumably God can see you as well, right? So there's kind of like this everybody watching everybody else taking place within churches and temples, right? And so there's kind of this creates another form of the panopticon, right? So power exists in many ways, right? And one of the things Foucault does is in all of his books, he's looking at how power is created in different aspects of society, right? Discipline and Punish was about the criminal system, the justice system, the laws, the prisons, law enforcement, the use of the state, the use of surveillance, and we kind of saw a little bit of that in those books. In these new two books I'm going to cover, Madness and Civilization is one book, Birth of the Clinic is the other. He starts looking at healthcare and how healthcare kind of creates its own power dynamic. And in particular, today's lecture I'm going to focus on psychiatry and psychology, right? Um, these texts, as I point out in the first bullet, these texts are case studies in how the sciences use the values of truth and health to establish authority and gain power over others. So even though science and healthcare always make this kind of like promise that they're only concerned with truth and the good of the people, what Foucault points out is they actually by becoming experts and authority figures, they end up getting power of their own, right? Um, and so let's look at mental health care, right? And what Foucault points out is that before the 1900s, before the 1800s, before the 19th century, in the 1800s, every community had people who were quote unquote touched in the head, right? In other words, people who did not seem to inhabit the same reality as everybody else. You had people that were referred to as the village idiot. You had people that were referred to as madmen. You had prophets. You had oracles. You had all these random kind of people that were individually set aside. They were still a part of the society. They were part of the village or part of the city, right? But they didn't necessarily talk and act like everybody else, right? And yet, it was acknowledged by everybody that everybody kind of took care of them because they very rarely ever posed a threat to themselves or anyone else, right? And so what Foucault's pointing out is that before the 1800s, literally for thousands of years, we've been living with these people that think and feel and act differently, and for the most part, it was fine, right? Like people just kind of looked out for them, and that's all there was to it. Then, late 1800s, early 1900s come, and suddenly you got these people calling themselves psychologists and psychiatrists who begin to create a norm that they call mental health. And they convince the majority of people that they're part of that, right? That, oh, you guys are normal. You're mentally healthy. You're well adjusted. There's nothing wrong with you, right? And they start pointing out the other ones that don't fit in and say mentally ill, right? Insane, crazy. And when they convince the people that there's something wrong with these other people, they convince them to hand them over to the experts for study and treatment. And this is the beginning of psychology and psychiatry, right? And some of these social sciences. Now, what Foucault points out in the next bullet is that behind closed doors in the mental asylums or mental institutions, the truth was that these experts didn't really know what they were doing. I mean, look at what psychiatry has to say about Sigmund Freud's theories now. The guy was giving like everybody cocaine as a solution, including people with anger problems and people with anxiety problems, right? Nowadays, we would kind of like, he's totally discredited, right? Well, at the time, he was considered like the god of psychology. And the question that Foucault wants us to think is, what's the future going to say about today's psychiatrists, right? Behind closed doors, Foucault points out they didn't really know what they were doing. They were creating torture as a form of experimentation on human beings who are now under their power. They were doing electrocution. They were forcibly uh, causing the patients to ingest toxic chemical substances that either made them into addicts or poisoned and killed them off, right? Um, they were drilling holes in human skulls as lobotomies to relieve the pressure. They were putting people into freezing water and forcing them to stay there. And the list goes on, right? They were torturing people to see what happened, to see if it worked to snap them out of it. That's crazy. And yet they're still in power now, right? They still have this psychiatry around that's developing new drugs all the time that gets tested on human beings, right? And then and it's not, you don't notice that it's a weird coincidence that there's this one medicine that like they give to everybody every decade, right? Everybody had for a while. Everybody was diagnosed with ADHD, and they would give them things like Ritalin, right? Um, everybody was bipolar, everybody was depressed, everybody had social anxiety, right? They go through these phases like 10-year periods. Now everybody's autistic, right? Now, what Foucault is not denying that that these individuals think different, feel different, experience different. He's not saying that this stuff doesn't exist, right? He's not saying that depression doesn't exist. That's not what Foucault's getting at. What Foucault's getting at is that the people who are going around coming up with these names and coming up with a list of symptoms and then telling you what to do with it and how to quote unquote fix it, what he's saying is that more often than not, these people really don't know what they're talking about or doing when it comes to the stuff that they're giving, right? I mean, look at how many people are reacting to these, antidepressant medications, right? Um, Thorazine, what does that do to people? And so, and the other thing, and the more important thing he's pointing out is that these people make themselves into experts to gain power over other people, right? And look at where we're at now, right? And the last bullet for this section, we're at the point where anybody and everybody can get diagnosed with mental disorders. If any of us in this class went in to see a shrink, we would probably be diagnosed with something, and there'd be a recommendation that we should come in for more consultations, which, by the way, are somewhere around $150 to $200 an hour, right? And then they'd prescribe something for us, right? So notice what started off with just a few individuals to gain power over, now like the entire population has the issue, right? Now the entire population needs their services. So Foucault's kind of trying to get you to recognize this expansion of power. Last book with a series of theories. Actually, it's not one book, it's a series of books. Um, Foucault had a History of Sexuality, Volume 1, Volume 2, and Volume 3. And there were plans for more volumes, but he ends up passing away from AIDS. And so, in the History of Sexuality, some of the it's great reads. There's a lot of great material in there. But I'm just going to focus on two ideas in particular. He tells us that different societies have different attitudes when it comes to sex. Some societies treat sexuality as what Foucault calls ars erotica, which means the erotic art. And what he means is that in these societies, sex is kind of like an art form, right? It's like an artistic form of expression. And think about how our attitude to art, right? Our attitude to art is like if you like expressionism or impressionism or surrealism That's your business, right? Like, no one's gonna like judge you or get you into some kind of therapy or arrest you because you like impressionism instead of surrealism, right? Um, when it comes to, you like sushi or you like Italian pasta, you like reggae or you like hip hop or you like metal, right? When it comes to music, it's a matter of personal taste, and people develop this taste. And sometimes you hate something at the beginning, and then you learn to like it, and then you love it, right? Other times, you taste something and you hate it, and you'll never learn to love it, and you'll always hate it. Sometimes you taste something else and you love it from the beginning. So, the same way that that's true when it comes to music or art or food, in these societies, the erotic art is the same way. It's a matter of personal taste. It's a form of expression. It's a way of finding your own personal pleasure. Guys, you eat what you eat because it gives you pleasure. You look at the art you like because it gives you pleasure. You read the literature you like because it gives you pleasure. The same thing is true with sex. The type of sex you pursue, right, is because it gives you pleasure. And so in these types of cultures, ars erotica is cultivated, right? People are allowed to cultivate whatever form of sexuality they like. And if you want to go experiment and you try some things and you realize some things you don't like and other things you love completely, that's your deal, right? And so that's some cultures are like that. What are some examples historically? Well, for a time in India under Hinduism, right, sexuality was seen as an erotic art, which is why they came up with this book called the Kama Sutra. And it's got all these, it's super old, but it's got all these illustrations of different sexual positions because it was seen as something that you could develop, like a form of yoga, right? That's an example of a culture, right? Now, Hinduism has changed over the years, and notice even the same culture can move from ars erotica to the other one over time, right? Another example would be the Romans, right? Under ancient Rome, under the Roman Empire, right? They're the reason. They're the people who came up with literally, um, they literally came up with what we call a Roman orgy, right? That's what we call it, a Roman orgy, because they come up with it, right? Everybody sleeps with everybody at a party. Um, that is a culture that sees it as ars erotica. The ancient Greeks, the ancient Greeks were okay with bisexuality. In fact, a lot of Greek men were bisexual. They slept with their wives for reproduction, to have heirs, to leave a legacy behind, and they slept with men because they saw them as their equals, and that's so like it was romantic love with a man, and it was reproductive love with a woman, right? And I mean, and we're talking not just like certain Athenian men. A lot of the Spartans, those of you that watch 300 with the CGI abs, right, and everybody has a sword, and the U.S. military loves the Spartans because they're so awesome and badass at killing, right? Well, I mean, the Spartans were bisexual. They slept with their partners when they were out in the military fields, out in war, and then they slept with their wives when they were at home, and nobody saw them as less manly for that reason. So these are types of cultures where erotic, the erotic art is something that, whatever floats your boat, as they say. Right? Other societies, however, see it as a ciencia sexualis, or the science of sex. Think about it. In science, in math, there's a right answer and a lot of wrong answers, right? So in cultures with ciencia sexuales, there is a clear right and a clear wrong concerning sexual acts and sexual habits, right? Traditional religious morality is an example of this attitude where there's one right sex and a whole lot of wrong sex, right? Um, and therefore it has played a role in policing sexuality. Um, for example, certain types of Christianity and certain types of Islam see, um, homosexuality as a sin, right? That's an example of ciencias sexuales. In some types of Christianity, uh, anything that is not a husband and a wife having sex for reproduction is seen as a sin. So even heterosexual sex is a sin, if it's premarital, or even if it's between married couples, but they're doing it for fun, for sex instead of for reproduction, right? So there's degrees of like how strict the ciencias sexuales can be, right? He points out that recently, some of you are like, oh, well, I'm not religious, I'm safe, I'm more modern, right? Foucault points out that in modern times, even medical and psychiatric sciences have tried to step in to police certain types of sexual preferences. Um, Sigmund Freud in psychiatry argued that there was a mental illness involved in homosexuality, and he saw it as unhealthy and deviant, right? Um, there are certain psychiatrists that do these kind of reversion uh, therapies to try to like remove the gayness from kids or teens or young people in certain parts of the country, right? And so, Foucault would argue that it's not just a religious thing when it comes to ciencias sexuales. Um, and the next thing he points out in the final bullet is that in ciencias sexuales, these objective norms of sexual behavior end up becoming not only a means of power, but a means of policing literally the most private part of a human, the genitals, right? It's a way of taking political public power and exercising it on the most private part of a human body, creating a nexus of public political control over private sexual lives and the personal bodies of citizens, right? The point Foucault is making is that ciencias sexuales is a way of either getting government, getting psychiatry, getting medical science, or getting religious morality to come in to exercise public control of people's private bodies and private lives. It's a way of exercising more power, right? If you can control who and what they do with their penis or vagina, right? How much more do you control the other parts of their lives? Obviously, Foucault's not a fan of ciencias sexuales, right? He's more of an ars erotica. Hopefully, you found some interest in Foucault's lectures on power, the way that power kind of multiplies itself in different parts of society. He has a lot more to teach you. Definitely give him a look, all right? And this concludes the last lecture. I know that there's still reading for one more postmodernist on transhumanism and posthumanism, and it's very interesting. But since she's still alive, she does a very good job of explaining herself in the lectures that I kind of put on there. So I don't see the point of, trying to mansplain, her theories on post-humanism. So I'll let her explain herself. All right. Hope you enjoyed the course.